Hi, I'm Chiara Phillips, and I'm a freelance cartographer and information designer that specializes in visualizing climate data. And yeah, I've been making maps for over a decade, and my background is in geography, GIS, and remote sensing. And yeah, in my time in the field, I've often felt that there is a lot of information out there on the technical side of creating maps, but often actually what I think really prevents people from creating maps are challenges that are more on the human side of creating and creativity. So today I want to take some time to actually talk about some of the things that prevent us from creating maps and how I moved through some of those blocks in my career, and even while I was building this map of the Pacific Blob using Copernicus Marine Service data, which was later chosen for the cover of the 2026 GeoHipster calendar. My hope is that, through this presentation that you feel empowered to play with this data, design your own map, and maybe even submit it to the upcoming Dataviz challenge for the Ocean State Report. So a bit of my own personal story. Earlier on in my career, I had years of unmanaged perfectionism and really strong creative blocks. And these really prevented me from trying new things and creating the art that I really wanted to create. And I've been on a long journey since. I've learned a lot about creativity, done a lot of my own research, and I now feel much more at peace with creating. And I think if there's a lot of designers around with open ears, I know that I just want to share how I overcame these struggles in case any of you are going through similar things. So the question of the hour is, in cases where we actually want to be designing maps, what is actually stopping us from designing? So I asked myself this question and other cartographers as well, and I found that we tell ourselves either consciously or subconsciously any number of things like, I don't understand this topic enough. I don't have the skills to do this. I don't have the time. What if I do it wrong? What if people don't like it? It won't be as good as this other map that I saw. It's too much effort. The data is intimidating. I mean, the list of reasons can go on and on. And I think all of these can just build up to the point of creative overwhelm that really prevents us from trying at all. I think if you're okay with not creating, there's of course no need to change or fix anything about your process or what you're doing. But if you're feeling like, the fact that you're not creating is weighing on you, and at the same time you're feeling creatively overwhelmed or uninspired, I think the good news is that it is possible to change this, and it's just a matter of having a slight shift in your mindset. And the key is really just to make your creative process simpler. So the first map-making blocker that I want to talk about is navigating decision paralysis. And one of the ways that we can make the decision-making process simpler is by limiting our options. And this can be in the general theme of your map, the data sources you choose. I mean, it can be in any part of the process that's related to decision-making. But for my example of the Pacific Blob map, I actually originally made it as part of the 30-day map challenge. And I think, one of the beauties of the challenge, and one of the reasons why so many people end up making a large body of work during it, is because, when you're sitting down and instead of thinking, okay, I can make a map about anything in the world, you actually sit down and you have a creative constraint. So instead of when I was doing my blob map, for example, instead of sitting down and, being overwhelmed by all the options, I was thinking, okay, today I have to make a map about water. But that was still quite broad, and I wanted to narrow it down further. But I needed a focused goal for myself. I think I needed a little bit more focus there. So I often like to make goals that are around my process rather than the outcomes of my work. So instead of thinking, okay, I need to make an award-winning map, or I need to get a certain number of likes on social media, or comparing your map to others, or some other external motivators, I find it much easier when my goal is, something around my process. So it's something like, I want to try out this new technique or this different software or a different data source, new color scheme, something along these lines. And so for the case of the Pacific Blob for me, I knew that I wanted to try out a new theme of Copernicus Marine Service data, which is classified either as blue ocean, green ocean, or white ocean. And I decided to work on something in the blue ocean category, which is one that basically describes the physical state of the ocean, so things like temperature and waves, wind, height, velocity. And the reason is because I already had made one before using the green ocean section, which is more about the biological and geochemical state of the ocean. And I just knew that I wanted to try out one of the other major Copernicus Marine Service themes there. So yeah, basically limiting my options and making a process goal of a different data set that I wanted to play around with really helped me prevent myself from getting into decision paralysis, and just in general made the whole process of making my map just more enjoyable and thus easier. And the last thing that I want to say on decision paralysis is sometimes just getting the draft done and not trying to edit too much while you're creating can really help a lot, because once you actually have that draft done, you'll actually have something that you can revisit and edit. And I also find just editing in general is often a lot easier than making that first creation. So you can see here is a screen capture of my map that I had a little bit earlier on. I originally was just showing the raw temperature values, but decided eventually that I wanted to look at sea surface temperature anomaly to actually show what was uniquely warmer in the ocean than usual. So to navigate decision paralysis, we need to limit our options. We need to make process-based goals instead of outcome or performance-based goals. And we need to make just good enough decisions for now instead of the perfect decisions, and know that we can always return back to it and edit if needed. The next blocker that I want to talk about is overwhelm that's tied to a perceived lack in technical skill or general unfamiliarity with new workflows or data formats. For this one, none of us were born knowing how to make maps and design with shapefiles and geotiffs. So I think it's really one of these things that's just a matter of exposure and allowing ourselves to pivot if needed. And then also just having the confidence that, we will figure it out, and the tolerance to do so as well while we're struggling with it a bit. I think in general, if you're feeling overwhelmed or with, new workflows or data types, know that you don't have to do it all on your own or invent the whole workflow from scratch. One of the more common things is following tutorials to gain exposure to new workflows. I have one here, for example, on how I made my original plankton map on YouTube. But I think in addition to following a tutorial, you can even make the task of following a tutorial smaller. So instead of sitting down and having to do the entire workflow all at once, maybe you can just do one step of the workflow and come back to it in a future session. I think in general, like I mentioned, I think it's just important to be really gentle with yourself and expect that you'll run into different confusing things that take a while to understand. And I think in general, a lot of technical fear is actually a lot of self-judgment in disguise, because, people are thinking, everyone else already knows this, I should know this, I'm behind. But the reality is that we're all just strong in different things, and we can all grow. And like I said, none of us were naturally born experts in this. For my case, I was also a new user of Copernicus Marine Service data last year, and it was my first time ever working with NetCDF files, for example. I think for people that use a new platform for the first time, it can be really overwhelming to not know where to download the data and how, or it could be a different file type than people are used to. So for the sake of getting exposure, I thought I would also just show you two ways that I have worked with accessing Copernicus Marine Service data, and just trying to demystify the file types a bit. So there are two ways that I have historically downloaded data from the Copernicus Marine Service. The first way that I ever tried was through MyOcean Pro, which is just this online interface for downloading the data, which you can directly put in your target variable, your bounding box coordinates, and the date range that you'd like to have before just pressing this download button that I've highlighted here. But actually, the more that I've used Copernicus Marine Service data, the more that I actually have been working directly with the command line downloads. And I think that this can be especially helpful if you're downloading a large data set or you just find Python easier to work with. So in general for this one, you'll just have to install the required libraries and such. But after that, you can just click this automate button and you can just copy and paste this command here and just adjust it as needed for you to download and access the data. And as for the file types that you receive, as a default, it's downloaded as a netcdf file, which has this extension .nc. You can also download it as a ZAR file. But yeah, I think for many people that have worked with geospatial data before, they at least know of kind of two major file types, one of them being vector data, so things like points, lines, and polygons, and potentially also raster data, which are basically grids of pixels that have different values. So yeah, for basically the netcdf data that you receive here from the Copernicus Marine Service, you can think of it like a raster with one additional dimension at least. So, you know, typically for rasters, you have your latitude, your longitude, and then some sort of value of a target variable at that latitude and longitude. And your netcdf in this case will have some values of latitude, longitude, a value in this, and yeah, in my case here it was the sea surface temperature anomaly, but you can also have time, for example, which is what I did for my plankton map, using that over time. But yeah, like I said, it's totally okay if it takes a few times to fully get it and understand what's going on. You will get there eventually, so just do slow and small steps on your way there. And lastly, one thing that I want to talk about is that I also hear often that design is just too much work. And I think it's true. I think, you know, design is one of those things that does always take some amount of effort. And I think there isn't a good way to fully eliminate this. But some options, again, are to just make it simpler. So you can add another creative constraint of staying all in one software. You know, you don't need to export to a graphic design software to make a good map. I've made plenty of really maps that I was happy with all entirely in QGIS or all entirely in ArcGIS Pro. Or I guess this is more my approach, is that you can learn to figure out what you find interesting about design and fall in love with the effort that it takes. I personally at least find it one of the most engaging parts of the process, and yeah, I think I can't be the only one if all of you are here today as well. But yeah, I think one thing too that I want to note on the topic of effort is that yeah, putting effort into your map is never wasted. I think, for example, for my Pacific Blob map, a lot of what made my design process easier for this map was that I could actually borrow it or borrow a lot of that design process from a map that I had already created before. So yeah, for both of these maps I made with a combination of QGIS and Illustrator. And yeah, I mainly went to Illustrator because this time around because I already had a workflow and process down, which for me in this case was a way to actually lower the challenge of creating. But yeah, also like a lot of the data retrieval and basic design decisions I could borrow from myself from the Plankton map into my Pacific Blob map to make something on a really quick turnaround for the 30-day map challenge, for example. And yeah, that being said, I think while I was really happy with a lot of the design decisions that I had before, I still felt like the data and the story of the Pacific Blob necessitated some design tweaks, which yeah, I think also can be interesting to hear about and help you decide what to tweak once you have established workflows. So I think for one thing that I knew I wanted to change was that I wanted to zoom in more to mainly focus on the Pacific Ocean, since that was the setting of my blob map. And secondly, I really felt like I had to create a new color ramp because, yeah, I was no longer looking at plankton and chlorophyll, but actually sea surface temperature anomaly. So I have some examples here of different color ramps on the right, and I think we can already start limiting some options here based on the data set that I have. So yeah, the three that I have here, I mean, one is qualitative, which is good for categorical data. So yeah, let's say you're visualizing crop data that has corn, wheat, soybean, and you want to see which fields have what, categorical would be a good fit for that kind of data. I think sequential is better for data that goes from low to high, that doesn't have like a really meaningful midpoint. And yeah, diverging is good for data that does have that meaningful midpoint. So looking at change or looking at above and below average, something like this. So in my plankton map, I was going from generally like low concentrations of plankton. So I chose some of these like more blues to help fade into what we consider being like quote unquote empty water, to high greens and even whites for the highest concentration of plankton. And yeah, this made sense to me because I was working with a dark base map and white was the furthest away from that dark blue in terms of its visual intensity. So it also helped indicate this high concentration of plankton a little bit more intuitively. And because it was pure concentration, it also made sense to roughly use a sequential color scheme in this case. But yeah, for my sea surface temperature anomaly map, this was a bit different. So I knew that I was looking at anomaly instead of some sort of sequential variable. So anomaly means like a difference from a normal scenario. So yeah, I decided to use a diverging color scheme and wanted this middle, which represents more of this normal scenario, to fade away and like look a little bit less prominent. So that's why I went for this whitish gray for this midpoint. I also had in mind that people have really strong associations with color and temperature, with hot and warm being more like reds and oranges, and blues meaning more cold. So that also informed the final color scheme that I went with. I also decided to keep the background of my blob map much more black and dark because the story was darker in tone and message than my plankton map. But yeah, in general, I'd say, despite design taking some amount of effort, the key here is that you're not always starting from scratch. Each project that you build can build off one another, and you're growing in skills, trying new workflows and data. And I think especially if you've done something once before with data from the Copernicus Marine Service, you now have a process that you can repeat and tweak with different data sets and stories. You can also try borrowing from your own work, or if it is your first time doing a process, you can try to use it again in a future project. So as I wrap up, I really want to come back to the main idea of this talk, which is that if you want to create freely, it can really help to make your creative process simpler. And a lot of the process of making it simpler just involves being gentler with yourself. So that can look like being gentle with yourself as you're making your first draft, as you're learning new things and building new workflows, and to just focus on goals related to your process rather than external outcomes that are often outside of your control. In general, I would just say, let each project teach you something, and really try to follow your curiosity when you're mapping. And I think the last thing that I really want to leave you with is, I know a lot of this presentation was on how to actually start creating when you're not creating, but I also want to say that you don't have to always be creating a high volume of maps to be a cartographer. I think also rest is a really important part of the creative process, which actually deserves a presentation all its own. But with that, I hope that this encourages you to experiment with a new data set, explore Copernicus Marine Service data, and maybe even take part of the upcoming Dataviz challenge. So with that, thanks so much for listening and happy mapping.